Well, as your correspondent suggests, this is an outstandingly gifted Australian woman, Catherine McGregor. She texted me today, and I suppose this takes television to another level. And she said in the text, let's give them a bit of Patrick Henry and Alexander Hamilton tonight. Majestic phrases that will light up the world. Well, before we go to Catherine, a bit of history. Patrick Henry. He was an American lawyer, a planter, a politician, and a magnificent orator. Born in 1736, he was the governor of Virginia. And at the Second Virginia Convention, he uttered, and I quote, "Give me liberty or give me death." Very relevant today. Alexander Hamilton is an extraordinary figure in American politics, a statesman, a politician, a military commander, a lawyer, a banker and an economist. And yes, the musical Hamilton, which cannot play because of the virus, is a fairly faithful representation of the Alexander Hamilton story. It's an astonishing story. He was one of the founding fathers of the United States. He was the founder of America's financial system. He was the founder of the New York Post newspaper. He was the main author of the economic policies of George Washington's administration, the first American president. Hamilton established America's first two banks. He believed in a strong central government, a strong commercial economy, and a strong military. And I should say, actually, a strong manufacturing sector too. He was orphaned as a child, but taken in by a prosperous merchant. He founded the Bank of New York before entering politics. He helped ratify the American Constitution by writing 51 of the 85 instruments of the Federalist Papers, which are still used, actually, to interpret the Constitution. His views were opposed by people like Thomas Jefferson, the third US president, 1801 to 1809, and the author of the Declaration of Independence. But under President John Adams, Hamilton was then made Commander General of the US Army, which he modernised and readied for war. In 1800, Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied for the presidency in the Electoral College, and Hamilton helped to defeat Burr, whom he found unprincipled, in spite of his differences with Jefferson. Burr became vice president and ran for the governorship of New York State, in 1804. Hamilton campaigned against him as unworthy. Taking offence, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel on July 11, 1804, with guns. Hamilton purposefully shot skyward. Burr shot and mortally wounded Hamilton. But Hamilton's ideas remain, and he's credited as laying the foundation for American government and finance. I suppose it can be said that while Burr may have won the duel, no one remembers him, but Hamilton, who never became president, will remain a giant of American history. So as Catherine McGregor says, let's give him a bit of Patrick Henry and Alexander Hamilton. And Catherine, give me liberty or give me death, said Patrick Henry. How does that fit with Western universities? He seemed to allow, to put it bluntly, China's communists to erode our freedom.
Well, indeed, and with the storm clouds gathering to our north, another phrase of Patrick Henry from that same speech, the next gale that sweeps from the north shall bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? Good question, Alan. Yes, we've seen further pressure exerted on freedom of speech on Australian campuses through that appalling orchestrated attack on the adjunct Professor Elaine Johnson at University of New South Wales. And it highlights the Drew Pavlou affair, and it highlights the findings of former Chief Justice Robert French, that there is indeed a chilling effect on free speech on Australian university campuses.
Catherine, just let me explain the background of what Catherine's talking about here. The University of New South Wales published the views of one of its adjunct lecturers, as Catherine said, on its website last Friday, Elaine Pearson. She's also the Australian Director of Human Rights Watch, and she called for a UN Special Envoy to be appointed to monitor human rights in Hong Kong, following those restrictive national security laws imposed by China in Hong Kong. Now, the university tweeted the comment on its main Twitter account. There was a furious reaction from China through its state mouthpiece, the Global Times, and there were orchestrated social media posts back home. On Saturday, the University of New South Wales, allegedly dedicated to free speech, deleted the tweet. And for a time, the story was taken down. It's now back up, but the University of New South Wales would have you believe, Chancellor David Gonski and Vice-Chancellor Ian Jacobs, that, quote, campus is a place for people to express all sorts of different views. Some of them will offend quite a lot of people. Some of them will be patently ridiculous. I don't mind. I want people to be able to give those views and other people to be able to object, said Vice-Chancellor Jacobs. Well, suddenly, Catherine, they didn't abide by any of that, did they?
No, it reads well. I read that code, and they also did an interview with Tim Dodd at the Australian when they were talking about their reactions last year to freedom of speech on campus. And yes, forgive me, I misnamed adjunct Professor Pearson. She wrote a very sound piece of analysis, basically about the effects of the crackdown in Hong Kong, about the one country, two systems, the breach of that through the suspension of habeas corpus and other liberties in Hong Kong. Very appropriate matters for a human rights lawyer to canvass. And there was an orchestrated attack on it. The university went to water. Its response has been grossly unsatisfactory, Alan, and the matter can't be allowed rest there. It is not sufficient that they have restored these to marginal prominence on their webpage. They need to explain what this means, what it's about. And the professor herself wrote a very eloquent point today about saying that the university boasts that you bring your whole self to work, which is the great diversity cliche that you hear mouthed so often in woke corporations and woke universities. But what they mean by that is bring your sexuality and your racial identity to work, but leave freedom of speech and diversity of thought at home.
Right. Well, of course, they want the Chinese money. That's brilliant observations. Might be time for the University of New South Wales to restate its commitment to free speech. And what's happening here...
Can I make another point,
yes,
Alan,
of course,
about UNSW? The thing that worries me about that institution in particular is that the Commonwealth of Australia is in partnership with it. It runs our Defence Force Academy tertiary education. So the Commonwealth of Australia, Dan Tehan can't look the other way on this, and neither should the Prime Minister.
Absolutely.
University of New South Wales runs ADFA.
So where do we stand?
People need to think about that.
Where do we stand in relation to this young man in Queensland, Drew Pavlou? Now, here's a brilliant young 21-year-old. In relation to the repressive impositions on Hong Kong, he had a peaceful protest in July at the University of Queensland. He was attacked by Chinese communist sympathisers and the attacks were supported by the Consul General. And this young 21-year-old now is the only person, not those people who are violent, not those people who are pro-communist, he's the only person been punished and banished from the university and his position on the Senate until 2021, basically because of his vocal criticism of Chinese influence at Queensland University. No one, I can't see a Prime Minister or a leader, political leader, stepping into the ring to support this young man, Catherine.
Yeah, and he's fought the battle largely alone. I think that eminent silk from the Queensland Bar, who's a free speech proponent, Toni Morrison, has gone into bat for him. Peter Varghese made some very, very tried to have it both ways, and after allowing Pavlou to be suspended, then rescinded that and made some fairly anodyne remarks in support of him. Varghese should know better. He's headed the Office of National Assessments and would be under no illusions about the way Chinese soft power, although that term now sounds rather absurd, doesn't it, when you see how muscular the interference in these tertiary institutions has become. But, Alan, this crisis has been a slow unfolding train smash. I went back through Robert French's report on campus freedom of speech. There was a parliamentary inquiry called The Crisis in Universities in 2001 that said that managerialism was crushing freedom of inquiry then. And the business model has been exposed now as China has become more assertive and we have become more dependent on Chinese students. It's done two things. It's made us mendicants in terms of Chinese funding, and it has also allowed the lowering of standards, because the other story in the Oz today that about students coercing their teachers to upgrade their marks because they're functionally illiterate in many cases.
Functionally illiterate. And just repeating here, these pro-Chinese students who opposed Drew Pavlou were screaming, they were ripping up posters, they were playing the Chinese national anthem, and they were assaulting the pro-Hong Kong students. And the response from the Chinese Consul General in Brisbane, Zhu Ji, who happens to be an adjunct professor, to your mind, at the university, was to praise the pro-Communist Party students for their actions as patriotic behaviour. And the only person punished in all of this is the 21-year-old standing up for certain freedoms. Catherine.
Yeah. It's been appalling. And I raised this case on Sky in my view, a little while back, just after the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. And I was the Twitterati, of course, went berserk at the comparison. Yes. But the point was, he is standing as alone as that man who stood down that stared down the PLA tank. He's on his own, and really it behoves a Conservative government to step up. You see, Alan, these universities are businesses. UNSW is a corporation. The Commonwealth has enormous power, and it's been upheld in the High Court in the Work Choices case. Under Section 5120, the corporation's power is a massive instrument for the Commonwealth to lay down codes of conduct for these bodies as corporations to implement and defend free speech. They should do it.
Of course.
Cut them off the teat.
Cut them off. I was about to say that. And, of course, there's the funding as well.